Hollow Creek was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, it was a town where neighbors left their doors unlocked and children played outside until the sun dipped behind the horizon. Everyone knew everyone else, and gossip traveled faster than the wind that rustled through the autumn trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and many believed nothing truly bad could ever happen there. That belief was shattered on a cold October morning in 1998 when the quiet rhythm of Hollow Creek was broken forever. A local jogger, following his usual path along the railway tracks, noticed something unusual near the edge of the woods. At first, it looked like a bundle of clothing, tossed aside carelessly. But as he drew closer, his heart began to race. It wasn't discarded clothing. It was the body of Claire Monroe, a beloved schoolteacher who had failed to return home the night before. She was young, respected, and admired by nearly everyone in the community. Her sudden death felt unreal, almost impossible to comprehend. The news spread through the town in whispers that grew louder with every passing hour. By midday, crowds had gathered near the tracks, kept back only by the yellow tape police had hurriedly stretched across the scene. The air was heavy with grief and fear, emotions the townspeople had rarely felt before. No one could understand how such a tragedy could strike their close-knit community. Parents clutched their children tightly, and friends exchanged uneasy glances, silently wondering who could be responsible for such a shocking act. That day marked the end of innocence in Hollow Creek. What once had been a place of comfort and safety was now scarred by the horrifying reality that a killer was among them. The investigation into Claire Monroe's death quickly grew complicated. At first, police believed it could have been a random act of violence, but the evidence at the scene told a different story. Her watch had stopped at precisely 11:47 p.m., a chilling detail that gave detectives a rough timeline of her final moments. The position of her body raised further questions. Nothing appeared chaotic, nothing suggested a struggle. Her handbag was placed neatly beside her, as though someone had deliberately arranged it to be found. Yet her shoes were missing, an odd detail that puzzled investigators from the start. It was as if the killer had wanted to leave behind a signature, something symbolic that only they understood. Even more unsettling was the discovery of a red ribbon tied tightly around Claire's wrist. The ribbon appeared new, smooth, and clean, with no fingerprints detected. Nobody in her family or circle of friends recognized its significance. To them, Claire had no connection to ribbons, no hobbies or traditions involving such an object. Detectives considered the possibility of a ritualistic killing, though no clear motive surfaced. The strange combination of missing shoes, a stopped watch, and a ribbon left investigators with more questions than answers. Witnesses from the neighborhood added little clarity. A few people mentioned seeing a dark figure near the railway tracks in the days leading up to the murder. The descriptions were vague, sometimes tall, sometimes short, sometimes wearing a hat, sometimes not. Each account contradicted the other, leaving police unsure if the sightings were even connected. Despite countless interviews and door-to-door questioning, no strong lead ever materialized. Instead of bringing the town closer to closure, the mysterious details only deepened the sense of dread. The residents of Hollow Creek were beginning to realize that Claire's murder was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Months after Claire Monroe's murder, the town of Hollow Creek was still gripped by fear. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk to school alone, and businesses closed earlier than usual. Just as people began to believe that the horror might have been an isolated tragedy, another body was discovered. This time it was Daniel Foster, a 24-year-old mechanic who had been well known for his easygoing nature and helpful spirit. He was found near the edge of town in a quiet field, and the details of his death mirrored Claire's in disturbing ways. His shoes were missing, his personal items were placed in a careful arrangement beside him, and once again a bright red ribbon was tied around his wrist. The similarities between the two deaths shocked investigators. It was no longer possible to dismiss the idea of coincidence. The evidence suggested a deliberate pattern, and the community was forced to confront the possibility that a serial killer was at work. Fear grew into obsession as neighbors whispered about the meaning of the red ribbon. Some recalled old children's rhymes that spoke of red strings of fate, connecting lives in mysterious and sometimes tragic ways. Others believed the ribbon was a taunt, a mocking symbol left by the killer to remind everyone how powerless they were to stop him. Police tried to reassure the public, but behind closed doors they admitted the case was slipping further out of their control. With no footprints, fingerprints, or useful forensic evidence, they were left chasing shadows. The killer's ability to strike again, leaving behind the same cryptic signs, suggested meticulous planning and a chilling intelligence. As the weeks passed, the town's fear deepened into paranoia. People began to question even their closest friends, wondering if the killer might be someone they already knew. As the investigation into the murders grew colder, detectives finally thought they had stumbled upon a breakthrough. Reports from nearby towns mentioned a drifter who had been seen around Hollow Creek shortly before both deaths. He was described as a quiet, solitary figure who never stayed long in one place. He often camped on the outskirts of towns, surviving off odd jobs and handouts before vanishing without warning. Witnesses remembered his unsettling stare and the way he seemed to linger near places most avoided. The timing of his presence, arriving just before the murders and disappearing immediately afterward, was too suspicious to ignore. Determined to track him down, investigators followed a trail of scattered sightings until they discovered an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. What they found inside chilled them to the core. The small structure was littered with torn notebooks, each page filled with unsettling sketches. Drawings of ribbons appeared again and again, sometimes tied neatly around wrists, other times floating in strange patterns across the paper. There were crude illustrations of shoes, rows of them, marked with initials no one recognized. Even more disturbing, the names of people who had never been reported missing were scribbled across the margins, as if part of some hidden list. Despite the disturbing evidence, the man himself was nowhere to be found. The cabin appeared recently used, ashes still smoldered in the fireplace, and food had been left unfinished on the table, but it was clear he had fled in a hurry. Police were certain they were closing in, but just like before, he vanished as though he had melted into the woods. Without fingerprints, photographs, or any official record of his identity, the drifter became more myth than man. For the people of Hollow Creek, this disappearance left behind only more unanswered questions and a growing fear that the killer was still free, watching, and waiting. Years slipped by, but the murders of Claire Monroe and Daniel Foster remained etched into the memory of Hollow Creek. The once lively town never fully recovered from the shadow that had fallen over it. Families who had lived there for generations began to move away, unable to raise their children in a place where the threat of an unseen killer still lingered. Shops closed, schools grew smaller, and the streets that were once filled with laughter became eerily quiet after sunset. The town's identity was no longer tied to its peaceful charm but to the haunting mystery of the killings that had never been solved. The legend of the so-called ribbon killer grew stronger with time. Some residents claimed they could still feel his presence, watching from the woods or walking unseen down the darkened streets. Others swore they heard whispers at night, soft and taunting, carried by the wind from the old railway tracks. Over the years, new investigators revisited the case, combing through evidence and searching for overlooked clues, but nothing ever broke through the wall of silence surrounding the murders. Every lead led to a dead end, and every theory dissolved without proof. What unsettled the town most was the ritual that continued long after the murders had stopped. Each October, on the anniversary of Claire's death, a single red ribbon would appear at the railway tracks where her body was found. No one ever saw who left it there, and no one ever claimed responsibility. The ribbon was always fresh, tied with precision, as if mocking the community's failure to uncover the truth. To this day, Hollow Creek lives under the weight of its unsolved nightmare. The silence remains, and with it, the unshakable fear that the killer was never caught, only waiting for the right time to return.